Hello everybody, welcome back to the shop. Today we're going to look at what I consider one of the most useful tools in the shop, the 4.5 to 5 inch angle grinder. So what you see sitting before you is a compilation of some of the different grinders that I own. I keep grinders here in the shop, I keep grinders in my welding trailer, I keep a few grinders even in my pickup truck because I do really feel like they're a versatile tool. One of the things I like to do is keep different grinders with different wheels on them, like a hard wheel, a flap disc, a cutoff wheel, a wire brush, a polishing wheel, etc., 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 so that while I'm in a process of doing welding or fabricating, I don't have to keep changing wheels. I can just pick up another grinder and go to work. Of this mass of grinders here, I think you'll see the ones that are the most worn and you can tell I have the most of, and those are the Metabo grinders. I am a big fan of Metabo grinders, but also notice they're not the only grinders I own. So I've got a couple of these rigids, although they're not all up here. I've got a Hitachi grinder. Don't ever forget the DeWalt grinder. Point being, there's a lot of grinders out there. So here's what we're gonna do. We got 4 grinders to take apart. Let me tell you a little bit about each one of them. First one we have is a rigid grinder. Second we have is a Metabo 4.5 inch to 5 inch grinder. Next we have the Harbor Freight grinder and the Makita grinder. Now all of these grinders are pretty comparable in RPM and in amperage, except the Harbor Freight grinder. Full disclosure here, the Makita grinder is a reconditioned grinder because the cost was 1/3 for a reconditioned grinder to take it apart, and it's supposed to have been fully gone through by the factory, should be in like new condition. All right, so let's start with the rigid grinder here. This has a pretty trick mechanism here for adjusting the guard. I kind of like it. Comes off that way. Start by pulling the power cord out of the back. The switch here on the side of this particular grinder has a lever that comes all the way, and the switch is actually embedded in the center of the grinder here in the back. The brush holders here are made of brass. They have a real legitimate spring on them, and they also have a nice piece of braided copper that goes from the brass to the actual metal conductor here. We'll get the brushes up out of the way so we can slide the armature out. Here we go. Let's take the gearbox apart here. These are proper machine screws, not the sheet metal style. That appears to be a proper hobbed gear. When you push the button to lock the wheel so you can unscrew it, there's a pin that comes in on an angle that engages here to stop this from turning so you can use the wrench to loosen it. Interesting. It's got a really nice, well-made fan here, not the cheap chintzy one. Feels pretty rigid. There's the balancing. You can see that they've epoxied all of these windings in place. That's for the high RPM so that the expansion and contraction and centrifugal force doesn't break the copper windings. That appears to be a properly hobbed gear. It's hard to tell, but I believe it is. There's our little switch. A couple of nice things about the switch is it has proper screw terminals. I don't like these push-on style terminals, and it does terminate over here with push-on terminals, but the power cord coming in here, this is line power coming into the switch, are proper screw terminals. That's pretty nice. So this switch is rated for 10 amps at 127 volts, and the rating on the side says that this thing pulls 11 amps. The switch is only rated for 10 amps. So that's already a little bit of the marketing wank going on there. The switch isn't rated for what they say it's going to pull. All right, well, let's move on to the next one. So first thing, these have a Phillips / slotted screw in the back of them. Wow, look at that. Very, very similar in setup. Brushes on each side. All right, let's see what we got here. One drawback already is these are like sheet metal thread screws going right into the plastic. They're not proper machine screws. I don't like that. Although I'm sure probably for the work and the lifetime of this tool, those screws probably will work. Still don't like it. This is a much different setup. So the bearing is actually in this bearing housing here. That's very interesting. So before we slide the armature out, let's take the pressure off the brushes here and pop the brushes up just a little bit so they clear the commutator. We don't take a chance of damaging the brushes or the commutator. Real similar in size to the rigid one. We have a elastomeric epoxy type compound to cover all the wiring to keep it from flexing. It's got a plastic fan, but it's proper. I mean, it's solid. All right, let's try to take a look at our switch here. Switch works almost the identical way to the rigid tool there. Almost makes me think there's a little bit of copycatting going on one way or the other. On the other switch, screw ends. However, this is just wires under the screw end. There's no terminal end under a screw. This switch is rated for, that can't be right. This switch is rated for 4 amps, 125 volts AC, 6 amps, 125 volts DC, or 8 amps, 250 volts AC. Only rated for 4 amps. Well, let's see what their claim to fame on the side of this is. 7.5 amps is what they claim this will actually draw. So let's look at this switch. It's only rated for 4. Anything over 4 and you're gonna start to overheat the switch, and if you stay into something, you're grinding real hard or cutting real hard for any length of time, the switch is not gonna be able to take the heat that's gonna build up inside the contacts of the switch. It's gonna start to melt down in pretty short order. Let's take a look in here. The armature windings are pretty solid looking. They're well covered in like a celastic epoxy type material. The brush holders in this one are brass on both sides. They're legitimate brass. None of the wires on these are real heavy duty. All right, let's go on to the gear head here. That's a centered metal gear. It's not a proper hob gear. A centered metal gear is a gear that's made by putting a bunch of metal together. They basically get it up to temperature and all the metal powder fuses together. Powdered metal gear is another name for it. It's definitely not a hob gear. Let's move on to the next one. Chevy hubcaps. Off my old work van. Make it real good to hold in parts while you're working on something. I don't care whether you're a Chevy guy or a Ford guy or a Dodge guy or a Nissan guy, Toyota guy, Mitsubishi guy. It really doesn't matter to me. I'm a Chevy guy. Chevy builds some crappy cars too. So does Ford. So does everybody. Everybody has their day at the races. So how interesting is this? This is a brand new grinder. I've never put power on this grinder ever. Look at the dust inside it. That's really odd. And the same dust is up here. Somebody's used this grinder, it looks like, maybe before. This was brand new in the box with all the accoutrements. Huh. Again, almost an exact copy of the rigid and the Makita as far as the switch setup, the way it's all put together here. Again, with the push-on connectors. Couple things to note here. The brush holders are not proper brass. They're made of thin steel, stamped steel. There's no way that I can see to relieve the spring on them. So we're gonna have to take them loose so that I can pull the armature out. Overall, the feel of this Harbor Freight one is just, oh, like a toy. It's no surprise, I know, but it just feels, well, like a Harbor Freight tool. There was a certain level of quality to both the rigid and the Makita. You could feel that you had something in your hand that was definitely more substantial. All right, we've got that apart. Screws won't even come out without taking the cover off. This is just really so odd. This tool looks like it's been used. It really does. Maybe it's one somebody bought and returned. So even when you're looking at this Harbor Freight one and you get in here, I mean, it's no shock again, but all the little pieces of plastic, the little clamp to hold the cord down, the strain relief, it's, you know, it's pretty much all garbage. All right, this switch, it's 8 amps at 125 volts. That's what the switch is rated for. According to Useless Freight, this only pulls 5 amps, but the switch is rated for 8 amps. So where's the lie? Somebody's not telling the truth. Windings are of much less quality. Again, no surprise. There's no celastic or epoxy coating on them to keep the vibrations and expansion contraction from causing them to crack. Again, the brushes here are just, you know, it's almost like a toy. The switch, The screw down terminals for the power coming in, And it does feel like they go into terminals. So they are terminals coming in from the incoming power, which is different than the Makita. Now, in all fairness to Harbor Freight, the price point of this tool is about $16 to $20. It's a $16 to $20 grinder compared to a $50 grinder. I'm going to stop right here and say I'm probably not going to go any further in this one. For the first reason, this fan is complete cheese ball. Somebody has used this thing before. It's funny, I bought it at Harbor Freight in a brand new box, but the tool has definitely been used. Again, they're powdered metal gears. This one's just held in by a little E-clip, but it feels like they've got it pressed into that bearing. If you look here, something to see is they've got a little bit of a varnish to try to hold these windings together, hold them down. But if you look at the other two, they got a Celastic type epoxy, you know, real strong material. This is not nearly as heavy duty. Again, no shocker, this is a $16 tool. This is cheese ball at its finest. Another powdered metal gear. Appears to be held on there with just a circle clip and pushed on. So I took the split ring pliers, right, and I just squeezed the split ring to take it off. The split ring bent with zero applied force. I guess you get what you pay for. Well, there you have it. Little cheese bally powdered metal gear. Little wave washer to help keep pressure against this. And this little split clip that's on there. There's a little key. It's a Woodruff key. It's a keyed shaft. And then you can see how they retain the bearing in there. It's a little tiny bearing. It's already low quality. It's already got a lot of wobble in there, but again, not a shocker. So let's clean up our mess and we'll save the best for last. All right, so when the wife gets done making cookies, you can always save the brownie pan for taking your stuff apart. Now, a couple of things to note about the Metabo grinder right off the bat. Metabo has a lot more features than the other grinders do. They come that way. One of their claims to fame is this has a clutch in it that, let's say you're cutting with a slitting wheel and the material pinches the wheel. Normally what happens is that wheel fragments, that wheel comes apart, usually violently. That's why you definitely have to wear safety glasses. It's a real danger. One of Metabo's claims is that they have a clutch inside them that if the wheel grabs, it releases the electric motor from the gearbox. The two run independently until you shut it off, free the jam, and then it'll pick right back up and it doesn't slip. Now I can tell you firsthand, sometimes when you're on jobs you have some hired labor. More than once I can tell you I've seen a laborer force a cutoff wheel on one of these Metabos, on one of my Metabos, and it's grabbed. The Metabo has released the electric motor from the gearbox. It sits there and runs until they can shut it off and free it, picks right up, and they never slip. We'll take a little look at how that works in the Metabo. I really like is the way this turns around here and comes off. It's a toolless change, and it also has multi-positions. The Rigid did have that right off the bat. The fasteners feel like they're higher quality, but it is definitely taken some oomph to get them out. Definitely built way different than the other three. The paddle here. The paddle just depresses the switch. All right, so the brush holders here are high quality brass. They appear to be a heavier duty brass than the Rigid and the Makita, which both had brass. They're obviously light years ahead of the Harbor Freight. Let's get the brushes off the commutator. So we got those loose. Something else to note, there's like a proper terminal, and then these have the correct kind of crimps around the stranded wire to make the connection. So you have a good current connection there. The push-on connectors are put on, you know, they're put on pretty tight. So here's the little switch that they have in it. This switch is rated at 14 amps, 127 volts AC, 25 amps, 24 volts DC. What did Metabo claim that this machine pulled? They said 10 amps, switch is rated for 14. So we know you're getting 100% duty cycle on your switch. Now let's take the end off here and see what we come up with. Again, the screws are definitely in there. Wow, look at that. Look in here. See the windings? Coated in like an elastomeric epoxy. Again, high quality. Very, very high quality. Wow. Look at the quality of that gear. How beautifully made. That's a needle bearing right there. That's an actual proper needle bearing. They even have this gasketed with a gasket. Now, something to note, this part here is like a fiber reinforced plastic. It's not metal like some of the other ones were. Here's the Makita. This is aluminum. This is a plastic part. All right, so here we are. Armature's out of there. Notice that all of the windings are completely covered in an elastomer. It's elastic. I don't know what you want to call it. It's like an epoxy. It's hard. It's what they cover motor windings with. Heavy duty fan here. Very rigid. It even has this interesting protector. I guess that's to protect anything from flying in and damaging the windings on that end. This is very lightweight aluminum. A beautiful little gear there. That must have cost a fortune to make. Right here is the money end of this thing. This is where the clutch is, what makes the whole clutch end work. Bearing. Bearing is held in place by a proper split ring. It's all actually pretty lightweight. I think that's because it has that plastic piece in there. They take a lot of the weight out of it. Here's the guts, or the part of what makes one of Metabo's features so special, and that is the clutch. Looks to me like it's just a bevel washer kind of clutch, but let's take it apart and see what's inside it. So there's a series of washers here. This is a cone washer, and I'm not sure if you can see that on the camera, but it's a cone washer. And then there's an opposite cone washer. The way it works here is it looks like these two cone washers, they sit opposite each other like that, and the pressure tries to flatten them back out. And then there's just a small, like a shim underneath there, probably for friction. I expected to find something like a race clutch at like a motorcycle, but that's truly not the case here. It's a nice, big, beefy bearing, man. Look at the size of the bearing in that one. It's a sealed bearing. It's got a shield in it, a seal. It's constantly lubricated. I don't know why they did that, but there's probably a reason. This is pretty highly engineered. So here is how this works. These two right here have like a triangular shape stamped in them. So almost like you'd have a D-hole on a pulley, like on an electric motor. And then this has that same triangular shape where this mates on there. This squeezes this gear. So it sandwiches them together and it holds them tight. And then what happens is these cone washers fit on here, and we preload those cone washers. They're like a spring. We preload them down so that they constantly exert pressure, squeezing this gear to turn. But if anything happens, the engineers have figured out the correct amount of pressure so that if anything happens, if something grabs the wheel, it's allowed to slip on that so that the wheel doesn't fracture. It's pretty ingenious. It feels like that bearing is pressed in place. A little love from the brass hammer there. One of the extra things they've added on the Metabo there is a shield to keep filings from wearing down that seal. It is a sealed bearing, which is interesting. Looking at this now, there's not a ton of lube inside of this gear head. It's not a lot at all. Looking at the parts here, these are precision made. These are well made parts. There's no junk here. Some super fine threads. Here, this is what applies pressure to the clutch mechanism. Looking at them, they look like real high quality threads. Okay folks, so I've got them all torn apart, kind of laid out here, taken some of the excess screws and nuts and bolts and got them out of the way. Now I realize this is not a 100% fair comparison because these are $80 to $100 grinders. This is in excess of a $100 grinder, the Harbor Freight. It's a $16 to $20 grinder. I don't expect it to relate to all of these, but I thought it'd be fair. A lot of times guys don't want a $100 grinder. If you're a guy who needs to use a grinder like once every year or two and you just want to have one in your box of stuff, by all means. I mean, the thing might last a long time, and I mean, You can buy a whole lot of $20 grinders before you buy one of these. Now, if I had to pick one, I would say the Metabo by far. You can just see when you compare the armature windings, the fan, the commutator bars, the quality of the construction. We're not even talking about the clutch. To me, the clutch is a safety item. Love the clutch. Wish they had come out with that years and years before. And I am a big fan of the Metabo. Now, for the middle guy, you don't want to spend $100 and some on a grinder. You want to spend $50 to $80 on a grinder. Well, both of these offer pretty good quality, but I have to probably go with the Rigid over the Makita, and I've always kind of been a Makita fan because I had so many of them in the past. But the Rigid, when you couple it with that lifetime service agreement that they're willing to give you with it, provided you jump through all the hoops and wear the grass skirt that they ask you to, they'll take care of this tool for you regardless of what happens to it. They'll fix or replace it for your lifetime. Kind of hard to argue this, especially if you're a middle gamer. Everyone, I hope you've enjoyed watching me tear these grinders apart. I hope this gives you a little insight into what's inside them and helps you a little bit in making a decision when you go to buy a grinder for yourself or for your business. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you real soon. Great. Now I get to spend 2 hours putting these grinders back together.